The whole adventure was essentially surreal to begin with. In my whole life, I had never experienced anything like being on West Wind. Okay, it was just different. The ship was made up of mostly coasties that had been shit-canned from other duty stations. We were bad people. You did not want to hang out with us. You would not bring any coastie off West Wind back to meet your daughter.
An old coastie recollects his time on the Arctic icebreaker West Wind and his swaggering, swilling, troublemaking, and charming crewmates. Hello, and welcome to the Mighty Pen Podcast. I'm David L. Robbins, your host and founder of the Mighty Pen Project, a free writing program for veterans and their families in partnership with the Virginia War Memorial Foundation in Richmond, Virginia. In this podcast, I'll sit down with Dave Schlitz, a former Coast Guard sailor who spent much of his career in the icy wastelands of the Arctic on board a ship that became famous for its hard-drinking, carousing crew. We'll hear Dave's hilarious story going ashore in Thule. Then I'll sit for a rousing conversation with author Dave Schlitz. Now let's first listen to Going Ashore in Thule, read with brio by Ken Moretti.
During those long ago summers of the early 60s, I sailed away to the high Arctic as part of the crew of the U.S. Coast Guard cutter West Wind. 200-plus coasties were on board with an additional dozen U.S. Navy Airedales on detached duty to West Wind, who flew and maintained our helos, and one U.S. Public Health Service doctor. The Wind, as she was known to her motley crew, that is, when we were not calling her something derogatory such as White Arctic Garbage Barge, was one of 7 1940s Wind-class polar icebreakers that had been built during the war. Our primary duty during those summers cruising Arctic waters was escorting Navy military sea transport vessels and tankers through the ice fields of Baffin Bay. The ships were bound for Thule Air Base in northern Greenland, where resupply had to be done during a 2-month period in summer. The Wind would also render assistance to Danish vessels, if needed, that were servicing the Inuit villages along the northwest Greenland coast, or deliver scientists and supplies to far-flung outposts in the Canadian archipelago. When those assignments were completed, West Wind would head back to Thule and tie up at the DeLong Pier, a longish rock jetty and mooring area that jutted out into the North Star Bay. There, at the end of our workday, liberty would be granted to all hands who were not in the duty section, or the Wind ran 3 sections liberty, or restricted to the ship. At 1600, on those days when I didn't have the duty, I secured from my regular in-port workday routine. I changed from my dungarees and chambray shirt into my undress blues, the usual Liberty uniform for Thule, and headed for the quarterdeck and Liberty. Once Liberty was granted, I headed up to downtown Thule. As you might very well expect, there were only a few places that us coasties could go in Thule, like, for starters, the local Air Force Geedunk. Geedunk, for all you non-sailors, is a snack bar, rec hall kind of place. If you wanted to relax for a little bit, grab some burgers and a Coke, and maybe shoot a little 8-ball, it was the place to go. The Geedunk was a place where a couple of the guys could sit on real chairs at a real table instead of the Wind's long mess deck tables and ass-hurting benches. As far as I was concerned, the cheeseburgers, fries, and Coke that I and my buddies all gobbled up in the Geedunk tasted a hell of a lot better than back on that ship. It was also, as far as us coasties were concerned, the place to go for liberating Air Force parkas. Our cold weather gear, along with whatever passed for Arctic survival stuff that we had been issued, was all pretty much World War II vintage, well worn from hard usage and only barely serviceable. A good deal of the gear had, over the years, been begged, borrowed, or in a few cases just outright stolen. The Air Force Zoomies, on the other hand, all seemed to have the bestest and latest stuff, including wonderful brand spanking new well-insulated nylon parkas with fur-lined hoods. Being the cum-show-loving coasties that we were, we soon came up with an almost foolproof way to liberate the parkas. After you walked into the geedunk, there was a coat room where our pea coats or foul weather jackets were hung on hooks just like we had in grade school. The Air Force Zoomies, of course, hung up their parkas. On busy afternoons and evenings, doubling up was the rule, just as it had been in school, since there were never enough hooks. It was therefore SOP for us to hang our pea coat over an Air Force parka. Since our uniform for Liberty and Thule was undress, informal if you will, blues, going ashore, most guys wore either their foul weather jacket or pea coat. The foul weather jackets were not big enough or bulky enough to hide a parka under. However, our pea coats were, especially with the oversized collars flipped up. After we finished our burgers and cokes, we would amble into the coat room and simply enfold the parka in our pea coat, tucking in the hood. Since it was too warm to wear our pea coats inside, we merely tucked them into the crooks of our arms. Without batting an eye, we'd calmly stroll out of the geedunk with the parka ensconced in our pea coat, then hopped on the Thule stage back to the wind. Anyone with a purloined parka understood that it would at no time be worn while we were in Thule. Not on the ship, and definitely not off it either. Never. Ever. During the summer of '61, while in Thule, we also liberated chairs from the Air Force. The crew's rec deck, for reasons unknown, was totally bereft of chairs. We only had a couple of small benches to sit on, and these were anchored to the bulkhead. That meant either sitting on overturned GI trash cans or leaning over the table while standing to write letters, play games of chess or checkers, or maybe work on craft projects. One sunny July afternoon, the Zoomie motor pool was called, and a pickup truck was requested to be dropped off at Westwind down at the Long Pier. With the said vehicles delivered, Bosun Mate Bob hopped into the cab with his number one assistant, Seaman Joe, riding shotgun. 3 other deckies jumped in the back and hung on for dear life as Bosun Bob zoomed off. The great Westwind chair hunting expeditionary force departed the Long Pier and headed for the U.S. Air Force barracks area. Bosun Bob would back the pickup into a parking space by the barracks entrance. Then the 3 seamen in the back would hop out and casually saunter into the barracks day room and liberate 3 chairs. After several stops, the back of the truck was loaded with a dozen chairs. 2 of the guys in the back now had to squeeze into the cab while the 3rd guy stayed there balanced a little bit precariously to make sure the chairs didn't fall off. Didn't need to be losing any of the newly liberated chairs. The great Westwind chair hunting expeditionary force returned to the ship, having completed an eminently successful mission. Cheers all around. The chairs were immediately transferred to the crew's rec deck, and the Zoomie motor pool notified they could come and get their pickup truck. Our other options for Liberty and Thule were going to the movies or perhaps the PX to do a little souvenir shopping. The girls back home always enjoyed getting souvenirs from faraway places. I know mine did. Or perhaps head to the base gym if you felt like working out or playing basketball, or maybe just sitting and sweating in a nice hot sauna. And while we did visit all those places occasionally on Liberty, as a rule, once we had cleared the gangway, we hopped on board the Thule stage and headed straight for the Airmen's Club, or the NCO Club if you were a second-class petty officer or higher, which I was not. Now, if there was one thing that the Airmen's Club was good at, separating you from your small change pretty much filled that bill. They had slot machines that took nickels, dimes, and quarters. One machine even took 7 dimes at once. Personally, I considered playing 7 dimes at the same time a pain in the ass, especially since the damn machine didn't pay off all that much. Consequently, I never played that stupid machine, preferring to stretch out my gambling time on the regular one-armed bandits. 7 dimes at once is going to get you broke real quick. Usually, I started with a handful of coins and played until I'd lost all those coins plus any I had won along the way. Once all my stash was gone and I had partially satiated the slots, I muttered a few very choice words about stinking one-armed bandits and headed toward the lounge area where the bar was located along with the nightly entertainment. Beers in the club lounge cost a whopping 10 cents a can. As you might expect, beer was usually bought by the case. Make that by the cold case. Now, in those olden times, Cans of beer did not come with pop tops and had to be opened with a church key. The bartender who sold you the beer would rip off the top of the case and open all 24 cans with his personal church key, quick as a flash. Definitely had a hell of a strong wrist and forearm. The buyer would then lug the case of open beers back to the table where his very thirsty buddies eagerly awaited his arrival. The most often heard expression during the course of the evening, other than the usual, "Now you guys ain't ever gonna believe this shit," was, "You fly, I buy." If you were willing to fork over the $2.40 for the case, sure as hell somebody would go get it. The guys who had lost heavily, maybe $8, $9, $10 in the slots would often be the I fly guys, at least until somebody realized that they were not doing any buying. Sometimes it's hard to straight face being broke. I know it was for me. Mixed drinks were only a quarter. Consuming copious quantities of 7 and 7s, rum and cokes, or maybe a few screwdrivers during the course of the evening was also pretty much the norm. Oh, myself, I was a Bacardi and Coke kind of guy. Maybe buy 2 or 3 glasses at a time to cut down on the number of trips back to the bar. Needless to say, by the time the club closed at 2300 hours, sobriety was a quality not found among us imbibers, and we were all imbibers. Walking out of the windowless club, instead of finding a dark and chilly night, we were greeted by the sun, still up at 2300 hours. Damn, that was definitely a bit numbing. All of us were pretty numb to begin with. Even with my agility greatly diminished, I usually managed to stumble aboard the Thule stage, sometimes with assistance, and crumple into the nearest unoccupied seat. Although the conveyance was simply an Air Force version of a school bus, it was called by one and all the Thule stage. Throughout the evening, there would be announcements in the Airmen's Club. "The Thule stage will be departing in 10 minutes for a tour of the base." I suppose if you wanted to, you could actually take a tour of the base, but none of us ever wanted to. Nobody sat in the back seat of the Thule stage, ever. Transporting thoroughly inebriated GIs from the club to their barracks, or in our case, all the way to the West Wind down on DeLong Pier, along bumpy, oil-coated dirt roads, was just about guaranteed to activate the old kidneys. Full bladders could only be contained for so long before they needed voiding. Hence the reason no one ever sat in the back seat. You might say the Thule stage was a head of Greyhound and Trailways in that regard, with the rear seat restroom. One of the highlights of our time in Thule was playing softball at the Polo Grounds. On the way over, we would stop off at the Base PX and buy several cases of beer. Upon arrival at the field, all the beer would be dumped into a large, slightly battered metal bucket, maybe 3 feet high by 4 feet long by 2 feet wide, and seemingly always more than half filled with meltwater whose temperature never got out of the 30s. That meltwater would keep the beers well chilled throughout the game. Sides would be chosen, and the game would begin. Standard softball rules applied with one exception. Players were allowed to take their can of beer out in the field with them. Hitting a can with a batted ball was an automatic out. However, if you were klutzy enough to accidentally kick your own can over trying to field a ground ball or catch a pop-up, it was your damn fault. Tough noogies. The team with the most runs was considered the winner. Of course, there were times when no one was sure which team had the most runs. If there was any beer left, we might play an extra inning or two to see who could score some more runs. If the beer was all gone, we'd call it a day and plan to settle the issue at the next game, as long as there was enough beer. Sometimes on a Saturday or Sunday afternoon, we'd go over to the base theater if a decent movie was playing. A 2-gallon bucket of popcorn cost a quarter. That way, if the movie turned out to be a dud, we could at least flick popcorn at one another till they politely asked us to leave, or as they usually did, throw us out on our keisters. Even on those days when we didn't go ashore in Thule, we would find stuff to do. Playing cards on the mess deck after chow, prayer meetings in out-of-the-way spaces, writing letters to our folks and girlfriends. You always had to be careful not to put the letter addressed to Melissa Sue into the envelope for Barbara Ann. Yeah, I did that once. We also like to call the local Air Force Reserve Station radio station KOLD, the 1,000-watt tower of power on the banks of the North Star Bay, to request they play Patti LaBelle and the Bluebells' I Sold My Heart to the Junkman, and dedicate it to the crew of CGC West Wind. They never would. On one Sunday afternoon, looking for something different to do, my buddy Jimmy and I thought it might be neat to go take a look at some of the Zoomies airplanes. Thule, unlike just about every other military base, had no security fence. It was surrounded on one side by water, ice during a large part of the year, and on the other by completely barren landscape that stretched for miles and miles and miles. The nearest vestiges of civilization, small Inuit villages, were hundreds of miles away. Jim and I ambled along Thule's dirt streets until we spotted some hangars. "Hey," Jim said, "that's probably where they keep the planes. You think they got any fighter jets over there?" Could be." As we walked around the hangars, we could clearly see that our guess was correct. The jet fighters were right there in front of us. Jim said, "Neat." "Yep, neat. Come on, let's go check them out." Next thing we knew, a Jeep rolled up to us with its horns blaring. It had an AP marking on it. Jim, of course, had to state the obvious. "I'm pretty sure they are not A&P guys making a delivery." Well, he was right about that. They were Zoomie Air Police, and they wanted to know what the hell we thought we were doing. Oh, Jim and I explained to them that we were coasties off the wind. We even showed them our U.S. government-issued Coast Guard photo ID cards, and we just wanted to see the jets. They made us get into their Jeep and took us back to their AP office. The sergeant on duty had so many chevrons and rockers that Jim and I thought that maybe he was a Zoomie-style super top sergeant, or maybe a sergeant of all sergeants or something. Anyhow, he called down to the ship, and after they verified that we were who we said we were, he calmly and politely told us to get the hell out of my friggin' office and to stay away, far away from any and all Air Force planes. You two assholes got that? Jeez, what a bunch of grumps. On a late summer afternoon, the newly formed, like about 3 hours prior, West Wind Mountaineering Club set out from the ship to climb Mount Dundas on the other side of North Star Bay. A half-hour ride took us to its base. It was a slow climb going up the loose rocks that formed the lower 85% of the mesa-like mountain. It felt like for every 2 steps that we went, we slid back 1. We tried our damnedest not to get into a single file going up so we wouldn't be constantly kicking loose rocks down on those behind us. After some 45 minutes of slip-sliding our way up, we finally reached the rock face of the upper part of Dundas. We worked our way a little to the right and began to climb over and between some of the large rocks. After another 10 feet or so, we reached a length of hawser line which had previously been secured around one of the big boulders at the top. We used it to assist ourselves in climbing the final part to the top. Upon reaching the summit of Dundas, we stood around admiring the view. After a couple of minutes of this, we ambled over in front of the Rasmussen cairn for photos. After a while, succumbing to the call of nature, we all felt the need to tap a kidney. Then it was time to start back down. We again used the rope, this time to lower ourselves down the face, climbed over a few more boulders until we reached the loose rocks, and kind of sat and half slid our way to the bottom. The descent down the rocks took us less than 10 minutes. At the bottom, we boarded our transport back to the ship. The West Wind Mountaineering Club had successfully completed its climb to the top of Mount Dundas. Only one we would ever make. The end of August found us still in Thule, where we waited for the last of the resupply vessels to finish offloading and clear Wolstenholme Fjord. Then the port would be closed down for the long, long, long winter. After all was finally secure come September, West Wind would nose out into the bay and head south, down across Baffin Bay, clear the ice fields, and at long last head back to our home at the Brooklyn Navy Yard. In the meantime, we waited. When the weather was bad enough that we couldn't play softball, we'd head over to the base gym for some basketball. However, unlike at the Polar Grounds, the folks at the gym would not let us take our beers on the court. They kept pissing and moaning about it screwing up the floor. Afterward, we showered off and luxuriated in a hot sauna. Walking out into the crisp 25-degree temps after a hot time in the old gym was rather invigorating. Just what we needed to get ready for an evening at the Airmen's Club. One Saturday night at the club, The entertainment was a group known as the Four Wild Deuces. They were one of our favorites since they always put on a good show for us. 2 men and 2 women. This particular Saturday night, for whatever reason, they kind of reactivated the Civil War. Every 15 minutes, they would have all the guys from the South stand up, and then they would play Dixie. 15 minutes later, they would have all the guys from the North stand up, and they would play Yankee Doodle. This went on for most of the evening, with first the South, then the North, trying to mightily outsing each other. As they finished their last set, they launched into God Bless America. Before we were even aware of it, we were all standing with arms around one another's shoulders, singing For All We Were Worth, glasses and cans raised on high, and we made them keep playing. We never wanted them to stop. Billy Yank and Johnny Reb we might be, but on that night, we were Americans, one and all. Even now, some 60 years later, I can still feel the emotions that surged through me that night like patriotic electricity. All the rest of the guys seemed to feel it as well. We were wired from all the booze, as well as all that adrenaline now coursing through our bloodstreams. When the Four Wild Deuces finally stopped playing, we remained standing and kept right on cheering and clapping for another 15 minutes. Then we sat and looked at one another with shit-eating grins on our faces until finally we staggered into the bright sunshine and boarded the Thule stage.
That was Going Ashore in Thule, read by Ken Moretti. I'm joined by Dave Schlitz, who charmingly goes by Dave with a little D. As we jump in, listening to that story, I made a list about the exciting hijinks and misadventures of going ashore in Thule. So here's what we have. Petty theft and beer. We have 10-cent beers and drinking and gambling. We've got softball and beer. I've got movies, but no beer, but throwing popcorn. I've got letters going to the wrong girls. I've got trespassing. Got climbing rocks and peeing. I've got basketball, no beer. And then the clubs with beer and singing, and then America. I love how you have made yourself a chronicler of your life with the mundanities. I want to ask you why those are the things that you remember so clearly.
Hard to say. The whole adventure was essentially surreal to begin with. In my whole life, I had never experienced anything like being on West Wind. Okay, it was just different. The ship was made up of mostly coasties that had been shit canned from other duty stations. The squids at the Navy Yard didn't like us. They invariably stuck us way out in the back of beyond when we came in there in the fall. The jarheads on the gate always gave us a hard time for reasons we never understood. So we were the badasses of the Navy Yard. The Armed Forces Police in New York City put extra personnel on. They put military police from outside New York so to beef up their patrols just because the West Wind was in town. You're talking about a crew of about 200 tops.
You had that kind of reputation.
The 3rd District would not allow us to have ships parties in New York City because they got tired buying hotel rooms.
What do you mean?
We would have a ship's party to bring in the beer and the booze and the broads, and we would tear up the room or rooms. And the hotels would call the Coast Guard on Monday morning. Ah!
That's what you're saying, is when the West Wind came back to what was the Brooklyn Navy Yard,
Yeah.
the cops knew you were coming.
Yeah, the armed forces police.
The West Wind had a name.
Oh, yeah, and a reputation. As a ship, we were also persona non grata at Cardinal Spellman Servicemen's Club. Individually, we were okay. There was no problem individually. As a ship, we were persona non grata. They knew if they ever had any affair for us, like a West Wind day, we probably would destroy the club. We were bad people. You did not want to hang out with us. You would not bring any coastie off West Wind back to meet your daughter. Other than the ops division and some of the senior engineering people, almost everybody got shit canned on there.
Any petty criminals?
Oh, yeah. There were some really hard cases on there. There were people I was scared of, particularly if they were drinking. We'd be out in the middle of the ocean and we got to have guys show up drunk. It's like, where'd you get this? Yeah.
Now, I'm assuming this isn't typical for the Coast Guard, or was it?
On the icebreakers, yeah, it was not. I think even the Navy icebreakers were close to this without ever being that way. But I was also on Staten Island, and while it didn't have a West Wind reputation, crew was a little bit better behaved. This attitude was still there.
So kind of across, no, not across the full Coast Guard, but
no, the rest of us.
But the icebreaker bunch.
The icebreaker bunch, most people gave us a wide berth.
Why is this? Because you were isolated? It took a special kind of guy to do this job?
Partly,
a brawling alcoholic? I mean, what?
Partly because we were all these people had this attitude. I'm on the West Wind. What the hell are you going to do to me? The only other place you can go is to the brig. And some guys did. We had a guy on the ship. He got caught stealing from the other guys, which is a big no-no.
It's okay to steal from the Air Force.
You can steal from everybody else. You don't steal from your own.
Honor among thieves.
Oh, yeah. And badasses. People had no problem fighting with one another, but you don't pick on the West Wind or they'll fight you instead.
Now, how about other ships? Okay, there's the West Wind, but there were other icebreakers. Were they as bad or as good?
I suspect East Wind was probably pretty much the way we were. North Wind wasn't. North Wind was Seattle's ship, and as such was kept semi-squared away. There were the 3 original Coast Guard icebreakers. Eventually, we took over the 5 from the Navy, but the crews were all rough and tumbled at best. Most of them, I don't think, were quite at West Wind level.
So what I'm hearing is that the icebreaker corps in the Coast Guard was sort of like the Armed Services Australia. It's where they sent all the quasi-criminals, the reprobates, the hard cases. Like, you're too nasty even for the Army. You go over there.
Everybody on there was pretty much that way. The officers didn't bother us too much because I think they were probably afraid of us, particularly the Academy ensigns who had never experienced anything like this in their entire life were thrust into this. They came from a very squared away, straight-laced place for 4 years, the Academy, and they're on this reprobate ship.
In the middle of nowhere.
In the middle of nowhere.
The literal middle of nowhere. So if the West Wind was a collection of reprobates, what was your failure that got you to the West Wind?
Actually, it wasn't my failure. It was...
No, of course not.
I wasn't supposed to go until the next year. The AGs just went on for the cruise, the aerographer's mates. We would report aboard about a week ahead of time, and after the ship came back in November, we would get transferred right back to the Communist Area Rescue Coordination Center. The year I was supposed to go in 1962, and Willie and Freddie Cox were supposed to go in 61. About 10 days beforehand, the chief calls me over and says, Schlitz, I'm sending you on the West Wind instead of Freddie because I think if I send him, he won't come back. I don't think they're going to let him come back. Freddie was constantly getting in trouble, never quite understood what being in the Coast Guard meant or even in the service. And the chief was pretty much convinced that he would never see the end of the trip. He would probably disappear one night in the middle of the ocean because he tended to piss people off like it was going out of style. So I went, and the chief also says, putting you up for 3rd class too. So at least I was getting a promotion out of all this.
What was your job on the West Wind?
I was...
other than stealing and...
On the West Wind, I was a aerographer's mate. We did weather observations. The senior guy on there, the AG1, 1st class, he would do forecasts and brief the captain on the weather. The rest of us, we all took observations. We go out there, look at the weather. We get the air temperature. We figure out what the dew point was. We get the wind speed and direction. We throw this canvas bucket over the side of the ship and haul it up so we get seawater temperatures. We looked at the waves, trying to determine their height and their speed.
When the West Wind wasn't sitting in Greenland and the crew wasn't drinking beer, climbing rocks, stealing, and getting thrown out of bars and movie theaters, the stuff of that story. When you weren't doing that, The West Wind's job was as an icebreaker, yeah?
Yes.
Walk us through that because you are the only icebreaker coastie we've had in the Mighty Pen. And I'm always pushing you to describe that. Tell me how the West Wind would break through a 5 to 10 foot ridge of ice.
Normally what they would do is when they see it coming, we would get ready for it and they would push the enunciators forward till we were going full speed almost and ram into it.
Well, tell me the bow.
The bow ended at the waterline and then sloped backward to about midships. So it was kind of flat and it would ride up and literally the weight of the bulk of the ship would crush the ice.
Oh, so you didn't ram it and break it. You would crush it.
Yeah, we would. With the pressure ridges, you're ramming in and trying to go through.
Mm-hmm.
Normally, when you're breaking ice, you would want to ride up on it and the weight of the ship would just press down on it and push it apart and create we were 64 foot wide in the beam, which would leave a wide track so that the MSTS vessels could follow us through. The pressure ridges, sometimes if they were bad, we would have to back off and ram them a couple times to break through. Most of the sea ice in Baffin Bay was generally about 2 or 3 foot thick, sometimes a little bit more, and we could just put on normal speed, cruising speed, which for us was about 13 knots, and just keep on going. Sometimes if the pressure ridges were small, we could go through them. If they weren't, we had to back off and re-ram them.
What was it like being on deck? I mean, wasn't it bumpy or was it smooth or how'd it feel?
Going through it was like being on a gravel road. You could feel it. We'd also watch the ice flip over. Well, the top part is covered with snow and is kind of whitish. When it flips over, the underside is ice blue.
See any polar bears?
We saw a couple during my years, not a lot. They don't venture into open water as a rule. We did see one off of Hamilton Inlet. He was sleeping on an ice floe as it drifted past, and whoever had the OD up in the bridge decided to back down, I guess so everybody could get better pictures. And as we got close to him, he realized we were there, and he stood up and walked over to the edge of his ice floe and, like growled at us or something. He was not happy to see us. Then when we kept getting bigger and bigger, he started backing up and decided this was not where he wanted to be, jumped in the water and swam away.
You guys sound like a bunch of thieves, frankly.
Well, we had to. We didn't have any.
I mean, chairs and coats.
The Coast Guard was not part of the Department of Defense. Initially, we were under Treasury for hundreds of years there. And then in the 50s, they put us under transportation, and now we're under Homeland Security. But back under transportation, we were at the bottom of the pecking order when it came to monetary allowances. So most of our supplies were really what was left over from World War II. They were old and wearing out. So whenever we had an opportunity to glom anything from anybody, we took it because we weren't getting it from normal supply channels.
As a young man, what made you join the Coast Guard?
I have thought about that many times, and honestly, to tell you the truth, I don't know. All my life, growing up as a kid, I expected to go into the Army. But sometime during the course of my senior year, I decided to go in the Coast Guard. And I've tried to remember just why I did it, and it has totally escapes me.
But good decision, yeah?
Yeah. I knew it even before I was halfway through boot camp that I had made the right decision going into the Coast Guard.
Why?
Because it felt like it. I was at home.
All right, so you were in the Coast Guard how long?
10 years and 4 months.
Like everybody else who served, it seems to have been a seminal part of your life. You're always proud of it. You're always wearing your Coast Guard West Wind hat. How did it change you from young man to the middle-aged man to the man you are today? That Coast Guard time meant what to you?
It gave me confidence, shall we say, to be out in the real world, the other half of the world. When I came out of high school, I had no idea what I wanted to do, where I wanted to go. If you asked me what was I going to be doing in 5 years, I probably figured I would be pumping gas someplace. I could see nothing. I had no ambition. There was nothing I wanted to do. So I went in the first 4 years, my enlistment, and I enjoyed myself pretty much. I had fun. I had adventures, and I had no place to go when I came out. It was still nebulous. So I decided to re-enlist, and I did it for 6 years. I also had to extend for 4 months so I could go on a West Wind in 63 because I didn't have enough obligated time to finish the deployment. So I automatically extended until January of 64, then re-enlisted for 6 years. So that's why I have the extra 4 months on my enlistment there.
Last question. That time in the Coast Guard helped make you the man you are today. How?
So I left a mark, which you had to. You can't, just like the guys going to Vietnam, it leaves a mark. No matter how much you want to walk away from it, it's still there underneath. Everything else leaves its own impression on you, but that is a defining moment for most guys, and it will stay with them forever. I'm not 100%. It left its mark on me because of what I went through on West Wind and elsewhere, what I had to learn doing all this, and how I had to accept things that I couldn't always control. Although I had no problem raging against the machine, shall we say. I knew when to, fold my tents and wait for another day. And I had more confidence in myself coming out. I had no doubt I was going to get a job. I even knew the field I was going to work in would be cargo traffic or freight traffic. I got a job with Swiss Air Cargo out at John F. Kennedy, and that took off. I got married. 3 years later, I went to college as a full-time day student, as a matriculate student. Spent 3.5 years in college, got out with degrees in transportation and business, graduated magna cum laude, and went on, just got a job and went on. Got married in my 30s, had kids in my 40s, had adventures in my 20s.
That's a drop the mic moment, man. Well done.
Okay.
Dave, thank you.
Okay.
A pleasure. I always love your stories. And so far, you're our only Coast Guard guy, but
there's not a lot of us down here.
No, but I tell you, if you're out there listening and you were in the Coast Guard, we want your stories. Give me a ring.
Okay.
All right, buddy. Thank you.
All right. Thank you.
The Mighty Pen Project is a free writing program for military veterans and their families, offered by the Virginia War Memorial Foundation, a 501c3 nonprofit. If you'd like to learn more about the Mighty Pen or just send us your thoughts, email us at mppodcast@vawarmemorial.org or use the link in the podcast description. If you're a veteran or a family member of a serviceman or woman listening to this podcast anywhere in America, and you want to learn how to best write and tell your own powerful stories, you can sign up for one of our Mighty Pen writing workshops on Zoom. If you want to read today's piece and many more, use the link to go to the Mighty Pen archive. If you enjoy this podcast, now please share it. Original music for this episode provided by Jackson Albrecht. Lastly, if you'd like to support the Mighty Pen's efforts to record and preserve these stories of service, adventure, and sacrifice, follow the charitable donation link in the podcast description. I'm David L. Robbins, and I want to thank you for listening to the Mighty Pen Podcast. It is an honor